Imagine this. It's a quiet, peaceful evening in a small suburban neighborhood. The sky is painted with the soft hues of twilight, and the world seems to be winding down. The sound of crickets fills the air, and the occasional distant car hums past. Everything seems perfectly normal. But in one house, something extraordinary is about to happen. Meet Max, a playful and loyal German shepherd. To anyone else, Max looks like a typical dog. He loves his daily walks, playing fetch, and curling up by his owner's feet after a long day. But tonight, Max isn't his usual carefree self. There's something in the air, something unsettling that only he can sense. His ears twitch, and his normally wagging tail is rigid, alert. He paces restlessly across the living room, his sharp eyes fixed on the front door as if waiting for something or someone. Max's owner, Sarah, is oblivious to her dog's growing anxiety. Sarah is in her late 20s, kind-hearted and independent, with a deep bond with Max. They've been through so much together, moves, breakups, job changes, and Max has always been her rock, her constant. Tonight, though, she's distracted, focused on preparing dinner while her phone hums with messages from friends. She has no idea that danger is lurking just outside her door. As Max continues to pace, a low growl rumbles from his throat. Sarah finally notices and turns her attention to him, confused by his behavior. "What's wrong, boy?" she asks, her brow furrowing. But Max doesn't respond the way he usually does. He doesn't come for a pat or settle down at her feet. Instead, he darts toward the window, his nose pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up. His entire body is tense, as if he's bracing for something bad. Sarah walks over to him, glancing outside but seeing nothing unusual. "There's nothing out there, Max," she says with a small laugh, trying to reassure him, and maybe herself. But Max isn't convinced. He pulls back from the window, his eyes now fixed on the front door. He's not barking yet, but there's an urgency in his stance that sends a shiver down Sarah's spine. She stands there, torn between trusting her instincts and brushing off Max's behavior as just a random quirk. After all, he's a dog. Sometimes they react to the smallest things, right? Maybe a squirrel ran by or a cat is lurking around. But then again, Max has never acted like this before. As Sarah debates what to do next, Max lets out a sudden sharp bark that echoes through the quiet house. Sarah's heart skips a beat. She freezes, eyes wide, her pulse quickening. Something is wrong. Max knows it, and deep down Sarah can feel it too. Before she can move, there's a faint sound outside, something she hadn't noticed before. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer to the front door. Sarah's stomach knots and her mind races. Who could it be? A neighbor? A delivery person? Or something far more sinister? Max positions himself between Sarah and the door, his growl deepening, his body ready to protect her at any cost. The tension in the room is palpable, the silence heavy, broken only by the approaching footsteps. And then there's a knock. Everything inside Sarah screams to stay put, to not open that door. But curiosity, fear, and uncertainty battle within her, making it impossible to decide what to do. Max barks again, louder this time, more insistent. The door rattles slightly as if someone is testing the handle. Sarah takes a step back, her breath catching in her throat, her hand reaching for her phone. And just as she's about to make a decision that could change everything, the screen goes black. What happens next? You'll have to stay tuned to find out, because what Max senses, what he knows, is something no one could have predicted, and Sarah's life may never be the same again. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and Max's low growl vibrating through the air. Sarah stood frozen, her phone dark in her hand, and her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The knock on the door had stopped, but the presence outside still lingered, heavy and foreboding. Max's eyes never left the door, his entire body coiled like a spring, ready to act. He knew something was wrong, something Sarah couldn't see, but now she could feel it too. Sarah's mind raced back to earlier that day. She had gone to work, just like any other day, greeted by her co-workers, completing her usual tasks. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. She had even grabbed lunch from her favorite cafe and come home like any other evening. But now, standing there in the stillness of her home, it all felt strange. Was there something she had missed? Had there been someone following her? Had she seen something she wasn't supposed to see? Max let out another sharp bark, snapping Sarah out of her spiraling thoughts. She had to focus. She had to stay calm. She stared at the door, willing herself to think clearly. Whoever it was hadn't broken in, not yet anyway. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was just someone lost or confused. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Max wouldn't be acting like this if it was something so simple. Max had a way of sensing things that went beyond what humans could perceive. Max had always been a smart dog. From the day she had adopted him as a puppy, Sarah had felt a special connection to him, like he understood her in ways that other people couldn't. He was always there when she was feeling down, nudging her with his nose or lying beside her when she needed comfort. He seemed to know when she was stressed, always staying close when she was working late or worried about something. But tonight his intuition was different. It wasn't just concern, it was alarm, something primal, something protective. Sarah's grip tightened on her phone as she slowly edged away from the door, her back pressing against the wall. She needed to call someone, anyone. But as she glanced down at her phone, her screen remained black. The battery had been low, she realized, too low to keep the phone alive. She cursed herself silently for not charging it earlier. Of all times for it to die, it had to be now. Her options were limited. The landline was across the house, and she'd have to pass by the front door to reach it. There was no way she was going to risk walking by that door with whoever or whatever was on the other side. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for something, anything that could help. But everything felt distant, out of reach. All she had was Max, and right now he seemed like her only lifeline. The footsteps outside had gone quiet, but the unease in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What were they waiting for? Were they still there? Max hadn't moved an inch, his eyes still fixed on the door, every muscle in his body tense. Sarah trusted him, trusted that he knew more than she did in this moment. Suddenly, a soft scratching sound echoed from the front door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Sarah's blood run cold. Someone was trying to get in. Her stomach twisted into knots, and her hands trembled slightly. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but panic was starting to creep in, seeping into her veins. She thought back to the lock on the door. It was sturdy, but not invincible. If someone was determined enough, they could get through it. The thought sent a chill down her spine. What did they want? Was it a break-in, or was it something more personal? Sarah racked her brain for anyone who might hold a grudge against her, but nothing came to mind. She had always kept to herself, friendly enough with neighbors, but never too close. She lived a quiet life. Who could possibly want to harm her? Max's bark cut through the silence again, this time louder, more aggressive. Whoever was out there had definitely heard it, and Sarah hoped that Max's presence would scare them off. But the scratching at the door didn't stop. It grew more insistent, more deliberate. Her heart was racing now, her fear escalating with every passing second. She had to do something. Slowly, she moved toward the window, careful not to make any noise. She needed to see who was out there. As she approached the edge of the curtain, her hand trembled, hesitating for a moment. What if they saw her? What if they were waiting for her to make a move? But she couldn't just stand there, helpless. She had to know. With a deep breath, Sarah lifted the corner of the curtain ever so slightly, just enough to peer outside. The streetlights cast an eerie glow on the empty road, but there was no one in sight. No figure standing on her porch, no car parked nearby. It was as if the night had swallowed up whoever had been there. But Max's growl told her otherwise. He could still sense them, even if she couldn't see them. Sarah let the curtain drop, stepping back from the window. Her mind was racing. If they weren't standing directly outside, where were they? Were they hiding, waiting for her to open the door? Or had they slipped away, only to return when she let her guard down? She backed away from the window, her heart still pounding in her chest. Max's growl had quieted, but he remained alert, his eyes never leaving the door. Sarah's thoughts spiraled into 1,000 different directions. Should she wait it out, hope they left? Should she try to make a run for it? Or was there something more to this? Something deeper? Something more dangerous than she could have imagined? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching on longer than the last. Sarah felt trapped in her own home, unsure of what her next move should be. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of the wind outside sent her nerves into overdrive. She wished for the phone to turn on, for someone to knock on the door and reassure her that it was all just a misunderstanding. But she knew better. Something was wrong, and Max had known it long before she did. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Max barked fiercely, launching himself toward the door. It wasn't just a gentle knock this time. Someone was actively trying to get in. The fear that had been simmering inside Sarah boiled over into full-blown terror. She could feel her legs weaken beneath her, but she couldn't afford to collapse now. She had to stay strong for Max, for herself. The rattling stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the deafening silence again. Max was panting now, his eyes still locked on the door, but the aggression in his bark had shifted. He wasn't just warning whoever was outside, he was preparing to defend. Sarah's mind raced for options, but the house felt like a cage. She needed to find a way out or a way to protect herself. She eyed the kitchen where the knives were. But could she make it there before they got in? And would that even be enough? Before she could make a decision, a loud bang came from the door, as if someone had thrown their full weight against it. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking her to the core. Max barked louder, more frantic now, and Sarah felt her heart slam against her ribs. She had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side of that door. But one thing was certain, she wasn't ready to face it. And then, without warning, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an unnatural stillness that sent a new wave of dread through Sarah. Max stood frozen, his ears pricked up, his tail stiff. He didn't make a sound, but his body remained tense, alert, waiting for the next move. But nothing happened. There were no more footsteps, no more knocks or rattles, just silence. Sarah didn't move. She waited, her breath shallow, her muscles tense, afraid that any slight motion would provoke whatever was lurking just beyond the door. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she strained to hear, to sense anything that might tell her if the threat was still there. But the night remained eerily quiet. She glanced at Max, who was still watching the door, his hackles raised. He hadn't relaxed yet, and that meant it wasn't over. In the quiet, Sarah could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, the unanswered questions piling up. Who was out there? What did they want? Why had Max sensed the danger before anyone else? And more importantly, what would happen next? Sarah stood there, frozen in the middle of her living room, her breath barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She didn't dare move. The silence after that last bang on the door was suffocating, thick with tension. She strained to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, the faintest hint that the person outside was still there. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of crickets. Max had stopped barking, but his body remained coiled, every muscle tight as he watched the door. His ears were pinned forward, listening as intently as Sarah was, waiting for something to happen. If Max hadn't relaxed yet, she knew the danger hadn't passed. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Sarah's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Should she make a run for the back door? But what if whoever was outside circled around and caught her before she could get away? Could she risk it? Or should she wait, hope they would give up and leave? But deep down she knew whoever was out there wasn't going to just walk away. She thought about calling the police, but her phone was dead, and the landline felt miles away, sitting uselessly on the kitchen counter. She couldn't reach it without passing by the door, and she wasn't willing to take that risk. Not yet. Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen, toward the knives still lying on the counter from when she had been preparing dinner earlier. If it came to that, if she had to defend herself. No, she didn't want to think like that. Not yet. There had to be another way. Max let out a low growl, a deep rumbling sound that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. He was still on edge, sensing something that she couldn't. His instincts had been right so far, and she wasn't about to ignore them now. Suddenly, there was a creak outside, the unmistakable sound of someone stepping on the porch again. Sarah's heart lurched into her throat. They hadn't left. They were still there, waiting, watching. She felt a wave of nausea roll through her as her eyes darted to the window, wondering if she should risk another glance outside. But the thought of seeing whoever was out there, standing in the shadows, sent a shiver down her spine. No, she wasn't ready for that. Another creak. They were moving again, slowly, deliberately. Sarah could picture them out there, pacing just beyond the door, testing her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her stomach twisted into knots as she realized they weren't in a rush. They had all the time in the world. Max's growl deepened, his eyes locked on the door. Sarah felt the tension in the air tighten like a wire being pulled to its breaking point. She didn't know how much longer she could stand it. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to do something, anything, but she was paralyzed, trapped by the fear that whatever action she took might provoke the person outside. The doorknob rattled again, and this time it was more forceful, more insistent. Sarah flinched, backing up until she felt the wall behind her. Her breath quickened and her pulse thundered in her ears. She could barely think, barely breathe. All she knew was that she couldn't let them in. Another sharp rattle. Whoever it was, they were trying to get inside, trying to force their way in. Panic surged through her, cold and all-consuming. She pressed her back harder against the wall, as if somehow that could make her disappear, make her invisible. Max barked again, sharp and ferocious, the sound echoing through the house. The door rattled once more, and then suddenly it stopped. Silence fell over the room like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she waited, every nerve in her body on high alert. What were they doing? Why had they stopped? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Had they given up? Were they waiting for her to make a move? Or were they planning something else, something worse? The silence stretched on, unbearable in its intensity. Sarah felt trapped, like a mouse caught in a trap, with no way out and danger lurking just inches away. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, hiding in the corner of her living room, hoping the threat would just go away. But the thought of opening the door, of facing whatever was out there, filled her with a paralyzing fear. And then, without warning, a loud crash shattered the silence. The sound came from the side of the house, where the kitchen window was. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she realized what was happening. They were trying to break in. Max bolted toward the kitchen, barking furiously, his claws scraping against the hardwood floors. Sarah's legs felt like jelly as she forced herself to move, to follow him. She had to see what was happening, had to know what they were up against. When she reached the kitchen, her worst fears were confirmed. The window, which had been slightly ajar to let in the cool evening breeze, had been pushed open wider, and something, or someone, was trying to force their way inside. The curtains billowed slightly, caught in the draft, and beyond them, Sarah could just make out a shadowy figure, their hands gripping the windowsill as they tried to hoist themselves up. Max barked wildly, lunging toward the window, his teeth bared, ready to attack. But the figure didn't back down. They were determined, their movements slow but deliberate, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let them get in. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a frying pan from the stove, and held it in front of her like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Her hands trembled as she inched closer to the window, her eyes locked on the figure outside. "Go away!" she shouted, her voice shaky but loud enough to be heard. "I'm calling the police!" But the figure didn't respond. They didn't even flinch. They just kept climbing, one leg now hooked over the windowsill, ready to pull themselves inside. Max barked louder, his growls feral and wild, but it wasn't enough to scare them off. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized this was it. They were coming in, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. With a surge of adrenaline, she raised the frying pan higher, ready to swing it with all her strength if they got too close. But as she stood there, trembling and terrified, she realized something wasn't right. The figure now halfway through the window wasn't acting like an ordinary intruder. There was something strange about their movements, something almost robotic in the way they climbed. It was slow, methodical, like they weren't in any hurry at all. And then it hit her. This wasn't just a break-in. This was something else. Something darker, something far more dangerous than she had imagined. A chill ran down her spine as the realization sank in. And for the first time that night, she felt truly, utterly helpless. The figure was inside now, standing in the dim light of the kitchen, their face obscured by shadows. Max was barking wildly, lunging toward them, but they didn't react. They just stood there, still and silent as if waiting for something. Sarah's grip tightened on the frying pan, her knuckles white. She had no idea what to do next. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't a normal break-in. She could feel it in her bones. And then, as if sensing her fear, the figure took a step forward, their eyes locking onto hers. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Max, barking wildly, seemed ready to launch himself at the intruder, but something in the figure's calm demeanor made Sarah hesitate. They weren't reacting the way a normal person would. Not to the barking, not to the shouting, not to anything. It was as if they didn't care. Or worse, as if they knew something she didn't. For a moment, Sarah's grip on the frying pan tightened, her hands trembling. She wasn't sure if she could fight them off. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Who was this person? Why were they in her house? What did they want? But before she could make sense of it, the figure spoke. Sarah, her name whispered softly, cut through the noise like a knife. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it was enough to freeze her in place. How did they know her name? The voice was low, unfamiliar, and it sent a chill down her spine. Max growled even louder, snapping his teeth, his body bristling with aggression, but the figure didn't seem fazed. "I don't want to hurt you," the figure said, stepping fully into the dim light of the kitchen. The soft glow from the nearby lamp revealed a face that Sarah didn't recognize. A man with dark, sunken eyes and a calmness that seemed out of place in this situation. He wasn't wearing a mask, wasn't trying to hide his identity. That alone made her stomach churn. If he wasn't hiding his face, that meant he didn't care if she knew who he was. And that could only mean one thing. "Stay back!" Sarah managed to choke out, raising the frying pan higher, though she wasn't sure what good it would do. Her heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst out of her chest. "I'm serious, But before she could finish, the man raised his hand, not in defense, but almost as if in surrender. His movements were slow, calculated, and there was something off about the way he carried himself, something unnatural. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers, and Sarah's fear deepened with each passing second. "I'm not here to hurt you," he repeated, his voice steady, too steady. "But you need to come with me." Now, the demand hung in the air, filling the room with a suffocating weight. Come with him? Her mind reeled. What was he talking about? Where was he planning to take her? Why was this happening? Max lunged forward, his bark sharp and ferocious, but the man remained still, unfazed by the dog's aggression. It was as if he knew Max wouldn't attack him. And that's when it hit her. This wasn't a random break-in. This man knew her. He knew her dog. He knew everything. "I don't know who you are," Sarah stammered, her voice shaking. "But you need to leave. Right now." She took a small step back, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. Her mind was in overdrive, searching for an escape route. But the man blocked the only way out. "There's no time to explain," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "You're in danger, and I'm the only one who can help you." In danger? Sarah's mind spun. He was the danger. He had broken into her house, and now he was standing there, as if he was saving her from something. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh, but the fear gripping her heart kept her grounded in the nightmare unfolding before her. She opened her mouth to scream for help, to do something, anything, to get him out of her house, but the man cut her off, his tone hardening. "They're coming, Sarah, and if you don't come with me, they'll find you. And when they do, it'll be too late." "They?" Sarah echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them making sense. Who was he talking about? And how did he know her name? Panic twisted in her gut. But curiosity and the chilling sense that he wasn't lying kept her frozen in place. Max was still barking, his growls low and menacing, but something in the way the man stood there made her realize he wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to rob her or hurt her, not yet at least. But there was something he wasn't telling her, something much bigger than just a random intruder. The man's eyes flicked to the window and then back to her, his face tightening with urgency. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "You need to trust me, Sarah. If you stay here, they'll find you, and I can't protect you if they do." "I don't even know who you are," Sarah shouted, her voice rising with desperation. "Why should I trust you?" The man paused, his face softening just for a second. "I've been watching you," he said, and Sarah's stomach lurched at the admission. "Not in the way you think," he added quickly, as if sensing her fear. "I've been watching to protect you. You're part of something much bigger than you realize. And now they've found you. Sarah's mind spun, trying to process his words, but they made no sense. None of this did. Who were they? Why was she in danger? And why was this strange man the one telling her all of this? "I don't believe you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You don't have to," the man said, his voice deadly serious now. "But in a few minutes, you'll wish you had." Suddenly, there was another sound, one that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. A soft metallic click, followed by the unmistakable creak of the back gate opening. Someone else was here, and they weren't alone. The man's face darkened. "They're here." Before Sarah could react, Max bolted toward the back door, barking louder than ever. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as fear surged through her. The man's calm demeanor shifted into urgency as he stepped closer, grabbing her arm, not harshly but firmly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "You need to come with me." "Now," he said, his voice low but commanding. Sarah tried to pull away, but her legs felt weak, her mind reeling from the mounting fear. The sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside sent a jolt of terror through her body. Whoever was out there wasn't coming for the man. They were coming for her. She hesitated for only a moment, her mind torn between trusting the stranger who had broken into her home and the unknown threat lurking outside. But the look in the man's eyes told her everything she needed to know. Whoever was coming, they weren't going to knock on the door and ask nicely. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The man's grip on her arm loosened, and he motioned for her to follow him toward the side of the house, away from the back door. Max, sensing the danger, followed closely, his growls still rumbling low in his throat. As they moved through the house, Sarah's thoughts raced. How had it come to this? A quiet evening at home had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And now she was following a complete stranger out of her own house, into the unknown, with no idea who or what was after her. The tension in the air was thick as they reached the side door, and the man paused, listening intently. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she waited, the silence outside feeling like the calm before the storm. Then, without warning, the door flew open and they were outside, rushing into the night as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, closer. As they burst out into the night, Sarah's heart raced so fast she could barely think. The cold air hit her face like a slap, grounding her for a moment, but the panic was still there, pushing her forward. The man led the way, his grip firm on her arm, while Max stayed close to her side, growling low and protective. The footsteps behind them were getting louder, closer, and Sarah's chest tightened with fear. She didn't dare look back. They cut through the backyard, weaving between trees and overgrown bushes. Sarah's mind was a blur of questions and confusion. Who were they running from? And why had this stranger appeared in her life, claiming to know everything about her? "There's a car up ahead," the man said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to keep moving." But as they reached the edge of the yard where the tree line met the road, a car's headlights suddenly flickered on, cutting through the darkness. Sarah froze. The vehicle was parked on the narrow dirt road, its engine idling, blocking their only exit. Her heart sank. "It's them," the man muttered under his breath, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. He glanced around, searching for another way out, but there was none. Sarah's breath quickened as she stared at the car. Whoever was inside hadn't moved yet, but she could feel their eyes on her, waiting, watching. Max barked wildly at the headlights, but it did nothing to deter whoever was in the vehicle. The tension in the air was unbearable. Suddenly, the car door opened and a figure stepped out. Sarah's stomach twisted in knots as she strained to make out the person in the darkness. The man beside her tensed, his hand gripping her arm tighter. She could see the shadowy figure walking toward them, slow and deliberate, their face still hidden in the glow of the headlights. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The stranger beside her seemed just as caught off guard, his calm exterior now a distant memory. And in that moment, Sarah realized he hadn't been in control all along. He had been just as desperate, just as afraid. The figure stopped a few feet away, and finally the light revealed a familiar face, someone Sarah knew all too well. Her pulse spiked, disbelief and confusion swirling in her mind. It was Emily, her best friend. "Emily?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper, her brain struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Emily stood there, her expression unreadable, her gaze shifting between Sarah and the man beside her. "Sarah, you need to come with me," she said, her tone calm but firm, like this was the most normal thing in the world. Sarah blinked, trying to process what was happening. Why was Emily here, and how was she involved in this nightmare? Nothing made sense. Her head spun, the panic rising inside her again. "What's going on?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaky. "Why are you here? What are you doing?" Emily's eyes softened for a moment, but there was something else there, something darker. "I'm trying to protect you, Sarah," she said quietly, "but you need to trust me, please." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This couldn't be happening. Emily was her best friend, someone she trusted with everything. But now, she was standing here in the middle of the night, involved in something far more dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. The betrayal stung, but there was no time to process it. She needed answers. "Protect me from what?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with frustration. "Who are you working with? Why are they after me?" Emily's expression hardened. "It's complicated, Sarah. There are things you don't understand. But if you come with me now, I promise I'll explain everything." The man beside Sarah took a step forward, his voice tense. "Don't listen to her. She's part of this. She's been watching you, just like they have." Sarah looked between the two of them, her mind spinning with confusion. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Everything felt like a twisted game, and she was stuck in the middle with no way out. Suddenly, Emily's gaze shifted to the man, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said coldly. "You think you can protect her? You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's over." Max barked again, his growls growing louder, sensing the tension building between them. Sarah could feel it too, the air thick with unspoken threats and unanswered questions. She was on the verge of breaking, the weight of it all pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then, in a move that happened too fast for Sarah to comprehend, Emily reached into her jacket and pulled out a gun. The world seemed to freeze. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the weapon, her mind unable to process what was happening. Emily, her best friend, was standing there with a gun pointed directly at the man. The look in her eyes was cold, focused, and for the first time, Sarah realized just how far Emily was willing to go. "I'm sorry," Emily said softly, her gaze shifting to Sarah. "But this is the only way." Before Sarah could react, a loud crack echoed through the night. The gun went off and everything happened in slow motion. The man beside her jerked back, collapsing to the ground, clutching his side. Blood spread across his shirt, dark and fast. Max barked wildly, circling the man, unsure of what to do. Sarah's mind went blank. She couldn't process it. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Emily had shot him, the man who had been trying to save her. "Sarah, we need to go," Emily said, her voice urgent now, pulling Sarah out of her daze. "They'll be here any second." But Sarah couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the man on the ground, gasping for breath, his face contorted in pain. He had warned her, told her that she was in danger, and now he was dying. Emily took a step closer, lowering the gun. "He wasn't who you thought he was," she said, her voice almost gentle. "He was using you, Sarah. I had to stop him." But Sarah couldn't hear her. All she could think about was the man's words, how he had tried to save her, how he had told her they were coming. And now he was lying on the ground, bleeding out because of her best friend. The sound of tires screeching down the road snapped Sarah back to reality. Headlights flashed through the trees, and suddenly more figures appeared, moving toward them fast. The real danger had arrived. Emily grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the car. "We have to go! Now!" But Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking back to the man. He was barely conscious, his breath shallow, and in his final moments, his eyes locked onto hers. "Trust no one," he whispered, his voice faint. And just like that, everything clicked into place. It had all been a lie. Emily, the man, the danger. She wasn't caught between two sides. She was the target, and the game had only just begun. Sarah stood frozen, her body trembling as the truth settled in. Everything around her felt surreal. The cold night air, Emily's tight grip on her arm, the man bleeding out on the ground. His last words echoed in her mind, "Trust no one." It was a warning, a final piece of advice from someone she barely knew, but who had risked everything to protect her. And now, as she stared at Emily, her best friend, the person she had trusted the most, Sarah realized that nothing was as it seemed. "Sarah!" Emily's voice was sharp, her eyes wide with urgency. "We don't have time for this! Get in the car now!" The headlights from the approaching vehicles cut through the trees, drawing closer with every second. Sarah could hear the sound of footsteps in the distance, the shadows of figures moving through the woods. They were closing in, whoever they were, but for the first time, Sarah didn't move. She didn't run, didn't follow Emily's orders. She couldn't. Her mind was spinning with everything that had happened, every moment that had led to this point. And it all came down to one thing. Emily had betrayed her. She didn't know the full extent of it yet, didn't understand why or how deep the lies went, but Sarah knew in her gut that Emily wasn't trying to protect her. The gunshot, the deception, it was all part of a plan, one that had been unfolding long before tonight. Sarah pulled her arm free from Emily's grasp, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not going with you," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sarah, you don't understand. They're coming. If we don't leave now, you'll—" "No!" Sarah interrupted, taking a step back. "I don't trust you. I don't trust anything you've said." For a moment, Emily just stared at her, her expression unreadable, and then something shifted. The concern on her face faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The mask had dropped. Whatever pretense Emily had been holding on to was gone. "You really have no idea, do you?" Emily said, her voice now dripping with a strange mix of pity and frustration. "You don't know what's at stake here, what you're a part of." Sarah's throat tightened. "Then tell me the truth." But Emily just shook her head. "It's too late for that. You're either with me or you're not." The tension between them was palpable, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she was looking at a stranger. This person standing in front of her wasn't the Emily she thought she knew. She didn't know who she was anymore. Before either of them could say another word, the sound of the approaching vehicles grew louder. Sarah's eyes darted to the road, where multiple black SUVs were now visible, their engines roaring as they sped toward them. The figures in the woods were closing in, too, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. There was no more time. Emily's gaze shifted, her jaw tightening. Without another word, she turned and ran toward the car, leaving Sarah standing there, stunned and alone. For a moment, Sarah considered running after her, but something inside her, some instinct she couldn't explain, held her back. She couldn't go with Emily. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Max whined softly at her side, nudging her leg as if sensing her hesitation. Sarah knelt down, wrapping her arms around him, taking comfort in the steady warmth of his body. He had been by her side through everything, her constant protector. And now, as she watched Emily's car speed away, tires screeching on the gravel road, Sarah knew that she had made the right choice. The black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of her, and the doors flew open. Armed men in tactical gear poured out, surrounding her in an instant. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she raised her hands, unsure of what was about to happen. Max growled, standing protectively in front of her, but she placed a hand on his back, trying to calm him. One of the men stepped forward, his face obscured by a helmet and visor. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes," she managed to say. The man lowered his weapon slightly, signaling to the others. "You're safe now," he said. "We're with the government. We've been tracking this group for a long time." Sarah blinked, confusion washing over her. "Group? What group?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the man lying on the ground, the one who had tried to save her. Two of the armed men approached him, checking for a pulse, but from the way they shook their heads, Sarah knew it was too late. The man in front of her spoke again, his tone more measured now. "We've been investigating a covert organization that's been targeting individuals like you, people with certain capabilities." "Capabilities?" Sarah echoed, shaking her head. "I don't understand." The man glanced at Max, who was still growling softly at his feet. "You're part of something much bigger than you realize, Sarah, and so is your dog." Sarah's mind reeled. She had no idea what he was talking about. How could Max be part of anything? He was just a dog. But as she looked down at him, she remembered all the strange things that had happened. How Max had sensed the danger long before anyone else, how he had been so fiercely protective of her, how he had always seemed to know things she couldn't explain. "What does this have to do with Max?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man's expression softened slightly. "Max isn't just any dog. He's been genetically enhanced, trained to sense threats, to protect you. You were chosen, Sarah, and Max was given to you for a reason." Sarah's head spun as she tried to process the information. None of this made sense. Her whole life she had thought Max was just her loyal companion, her best friend. But now she was being told that he had been part of some secret experiment, that she had been part of something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why was I chosen?" The man sighed. "You have a connection with Max that most people wouldn't understand. It's rare, and it made you a target. The organization that was after you wanted to exploit that connection. They were going to use you to further their agenda." Sarah's stomach churned. She felt sick. Everything she had thought she knew about her life, about Max, was unraveling before her eyes. "We can protect you," the man continued. "But you need to come with us. There's still a lot you don't know and a lot we need to explain." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know who to trust anymore. First, the man who had broken into her house had claimed to be protecting her. Then Emily had turned out to be involved in some kind of conspiracy. And now these men, who claimed to be from the government, were telling her that she and Max were part of some secret experiment. But as she looked at Max, at the way he stood protectively in front of her, she realized something. No matter what had happened, no matter how many lies she had been told, Max had always been there for her. He had always protected her. And that was something she could trust. She took a deep breath, her decision made. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll go with you." The man nodded, signaling to the others. "We'll keep you safe, Sarah. You and Max." As they led her toward one of the SUVs, Sarah cast one last glance at the house she had called home, at the place where her life had changed forever. It felt like a different world now, a world she could never return to. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and mysteries she hadn't yet begun to unravel. But as long as Max was by her side, Sarah knew she could face whatever was coming next. And so, as the SUV's engine roared to life and they drove off into the night, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The truth, whatever it was, would come in time. For now, all that mattered was that she and Max were together, and that no matter what, they would face the future side by side.